where we pick up in the narrative of the Passion and Gospel of Luke, we have Jesus and the disciples leaving the upper room where they had the Passover meal. And now they find themselves going to the garden. So let's take a look at what happens there. It says, Jesus left and made his way to the Mount of Olives, as was his custom. And the disciples followed him. When he arrived, he said to them, "Pray that you won't give in to temptation." Hold on to that idea. He withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and prayed. He said, "Father, if it's your will, take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not my will, but your will must be done." Then a heavenly angel appeared to him and strengthened him. He was in anguish and prayed even more earnestly. His sweat became like drops of blood falling on the ground. When he got up from praying, he went to the disciples, and he found them asleep, overcome by grief. He said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray, so that you won't give in to temptation." It's a powerful story and one we've heard before, likely have heard before. But one of the things that I want to make sure we take note of is that he says to the disciples, pray so that you might not fall into temptation. He brings this up twice to his disciples. And Jesus himself is struggling with temptation. Temptation to forego what is coming. Because as he says, his spirit is willing, or his body is willing, but his spirit is weak. He knows that he can do it. But there's a part of Jesus that doesn't want to do it. And knowing what it is, I can't blame Jesus. And yet it is that very thing, that Good Friday act of crucifixion, that becomes the centerpiece for overcoming death. And we'll get to that. But what I wanted to do is point out something that Luke does here that I think is absolute literary brilliance. If we remember back to what we find at the beginning of Luke, we find a story where Jesus is in the wilderness, in the desert. And while he's in the wilderness, he's praying for 40 days. And while he's in that midst of praying and fasting, he's tempted. Remember that story? Satan comes to Jesus and tempts him. Turn this stone into bread. Give yourself to me and all the people, and I will make you king over all that is. And time after time, Jesus continues to push back. Do not test the Father. Do not live on bread alone. Sometimes when we think about that story, we realize that Jesus is sharing this moment with us, this moment of temptation with us, then and now in chapter 22, in order that we might realize just how real temptation is and just how much temptation can veer us from the course that God desires. Now, does God desire for Jesus to be crucified? No. God doesn't desire that someone go through a horrific event, a tragedy. Rather, what God desires is that we can overcome those tragedies. We can overcome those moments that God sees and weeps over. We can't just move away from the cost of discipleship. We talked about that yesterday. What we can do is move through those moments. And Jesus here is inviting us not to fall temptation of not going through the storms, but trusting that God will take us through them. Amen.